It was one of those sweltering summer evenings when the air felt heavy with the promise of rain that refused to arrive. I, Elena, 38 years old and widowed for far too long, sat quietly in our dimly lit living room, my silk robe draped softly around me, catching the gentle golden glow of a single lamp. The heat wrapped around everything like an unwelcome embrace, making even the smallest movements feel slow and tiring. The windows stood open, yet no refreshing breeze found its way inside. Only the distant humming of cicadas and the low, occasional rumble of thunder broke the thick silence. I had been sitting there for what seemed like an eternity, though in truth barely 20 minutes had passed. My mind wandered freely between everyday thoughts and deeper, quieter sorrows. 3 long years had slipped by since my husband's passing. The sharp pain of grief had softened over time, but a gentle, persistent ache remained, a silent shadow that walked beside me through the days. Tonight, however, that ache felt different, more restless, as if the gathering storm outside had awakened something unsettled within my heart. I shifted on the couch, the smooth fabric of my robe gliding against my skin, and released a slow, steady breath. The soft light from the lamp painted long, peaceful shadows across the walls, bathing the room in a warm, intimate hue. My fingers absently traced the edge of my robe as I lost myself in thought. Then, the soft sound of water trickling from the bathroom reached my ears. Moments later, Jake stepped into the living room, fresh from his shower. At 22, he carried the restless energy of youth mixed with the early strength of manhood. His dark hair was still damp and tousled, and a simple towel was wrapped securely around his waist. For a brief second, I noticed how much he resembled his father. The same broad shoulders, the same natural grace in his movements. The resemblance caught me off guard, stirring old memories. I quickly looked away, turning my gaze toward the open window. Jake was my stepson, a living reminder of the family life I had once known. We shared this house politely but kept a respectful distance. Our conversations were usually short and practical. He was still discovering who he wanted to become, while I was learning how to move forward as a woman on her own after loss. Suddenly, the power went out without any warning. The lamp flickered once and plunged the room into complete darkness. A deep roll of thunder echoed through the walls. Startled, I stood up too quickly, my foot catching on the edge of the ottoman. I stumbled forward, reaching out instinctively for balance. My hands found Jake's shoulders, warm and still slightly damp from the shower. He caught me gently, his hands steadying my arms as I regained my footing. For a heartbeat, we stood there in the dark, the air between us filled with surprise and an unspoken sense of closeness. The storm outside seemed to mirror the quiet uncertainty we both felt. "Sorry about that," Jake murmured softly, his voice carrying a hint of awkwardness. We stepped back from each other carefully. In the faint moonlight filtering through the windows, our eyes met for a long moment. It was a silent exchange that felt heavier than usual, filled with things we rarely spoke about: loss, loneliness, and the strange reality of living together after everything that had happened. The rest of that evening passed in a gentle haze. Jake went to search for flashlights while I remained in the living room, my thoughts swirling. The storm continued to build outside, but inside, a different kind of emotional storm was stirring. One of memories, quiet longing for connection, and the slow realization that we had both been carrying our grief alone for too long. Later that night, still restless in the darkness, I found myself in the kitchen. I had changed into a loose sundress that helped a little against the clinging heat. The air felt almost suffocating, thick with the scent of impending rain. My mind kept returning to that brief moment in the living room, the accidental stumble, the steadying touch, the shared silence. It reminded me how long it had been since anyone had been there to catch me, even for a second. I leaned against the cool marble counter, sipping water and trying to calm my racing thoughts. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the stillness. Soon I heard the soft padding of bare feet on the tile. Jake walked in, shirtless in the heat and wearing loose shorts, moving with that easy, youthful stride. He opened the fridge, and the soft light spilled out, illuminating his face for a moment. We exchanged a quiet greeting. He grabbed a bottle of water and took a long drink. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low and a little rough from the warmth. I shook my head and offered a small smile. "It's just too hot tonight. The storm is taking its time." We stood there talking longer than we had in months, about the power outage, about how the house felt different in the dark, and eventually about his father. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with fond memories and shared sadness. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly seeing each other, not just passing as polite housemates. The blackout stretched into the next evening. The oppressive heat remained, and the house stayed wrapped in darkness. I wandered through the rooms with a lantern, its soft, flickering light guiding my steps. Eventually, I made my way to the garage where another lantern glowed on the workbench. Jake was there, focused on repairing an old radio, his hands working carefully with wires and tools. The familiar smell of oil and metal filled the air. I leaned against the workbench and watched him for a while. There was something comforting about seeing him engaged in a task. Something steady and capable. "You're getting good at fixing things," I said softly, a gentle teasing note in my voice. "Your dad would be proud." Jake looked up, his expression thoughtful. We talked for a long time, about memories of his father, about the challenges of growing up too fast, and about my own struggles with loneliness after losing my husband. The darkness around us made the conversation feel safer, more honest. In that quiet garage, surrounded by the distant rumble of thunder, we began to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. The following evening, we sat together on the back porch steps. The stormy sky hung low and heavy, and the air was alive with the sound of crickets. A bottle of warm wine rested between us, though we sipped it slowly, mostly for something to do with our hands. The night felt intimate in its darkness. We spoke openly about grief, about how silence had kept us apart, and about the importance of family, even when it's complicated and changed by loss. Jake turned to me, his voice sincere. "I know I haven't been around much emotionally, but I'm here, Elena. We don't have to go through this alone anymore." His words touched something deep inside me. I felt the weight I had been carrying begin to lighten. We talked late into the night, about hopes for the future, about healing, and about finding new ways to support each other. There were no grand declarations, only honest, heartfelt words shared between a stepmother and stepson who had both been wounded by the same loss. By the time the conversation wound down, the storm still hadn't broken, but something important had shifted inside our home. The real tempest had been the emotional distance we had allowed to grow. In its place, a quiet, genuine connection was beginning to form, one built on understanding, shared memories, and the simple comfort of not being alone. The days that followed the blackout brought a new chapter for us. We continued talking more, helping each other with small tasks, and slowly rebuilding a warmer, more supportive family bond. The heat eventually broke, the rain finally came, and with it arrived a sense of renewal, not just for the earth, but for the two of us as well.